The Lennox ball had been announced for a fortnight, and every family of consequence within 40 miles had accepted. Eleanor stood near the far column of the ballroom in a gown of pale gray silk that had been her mother's, its seams let out twice and pressed that morning by her own hand. Around her, the season's young women moved in clouds of white and ivory, their diamonds catching the light of 300 candles. She was not one of them. She was, by the terms of a contract signed 10 months ago in a solicitor's office on Chancery Lane, the Duchess of Lennox. In 2 months, she would be nothing again. The room understood this. It had understood from the first week when the announcement appeared in the Gazette, and every matron in 3 counties had leaned across her breakfast table to read it aloud. A duke does not marry a physician's daughter with £800 of debt and no connections unless there is an arrangement, and arrangements, by their nature, end. Lady Marguerite Ashworth, the Duchess Dowager, stood across the ballroom in a gown of midnight blue with sapphires at her throat, receiving compliments on the evening's arrangements with the serene confidence of a woman who had never doubted the order of things. She had permitted the marriage. She had not endorsed it. And she had made it quietly, immovably clear to every person of standing in the county that her son's bride was a temporary inhabitant of a permanent house. Eleanor felt the familiar pressure of being looked through. She held her glass of lemonade with both hands and kept her posture as her mother had taught her, straight at the spine, soft at the shoulders. The lemonade was warm. The room was warm. The gown, which had fit her mother's slighter frame, pulled across her ribs when she breathed. Across the room, James Ashworth, the Duke of Lennox, stood beside the fireplace with Lord Hatherley, his face composed in the expression Eleanor had come to recognize as his formal mask, a stillness so complete it might have been carved. He did not look at her. He had not looked at her for the first hour of the evening. And then, as Lady Marguerite's voice rose in laughter at some remark of Miss Pemberton's, his gaze moved to Eleanor and held. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. His eyes found the place where the gray silk pulled at her ribs, found her hands around the warm glass, found the careful straightness of her spine. Then he looked away, and the mask returned, and Eleanor told herself it had been nothing. She did not see what the glass betrayed. Her knuckles had gone white. If you have ever stood at the edge of a room where you were technically welcome and felt the walls decide otherwise, you already know what Eleanor carried in her chest that evening. She did not know it yet. You might. The contract had been Mr. Harding's idea, or so Eleanor had been told. In truth, she suspected the Duchess Dowager had dictated the terms from the drawing room at Lennox Park, while the solicitor wrote them down in his careful, sloping hand. The Duke of Lennox required a wife for the period of 1 calendar year, commencing from the date of the ceremony at St. George's, Hanover Square. The bride would receive a settlement of £3,000 per annum for the duration of the marriage, and a lump sum of £1,000 upon its dissolution. In exchange, she would fulfill the public duties of a duchess, manage the household staff at Lennox Park, and make no claim upon the estate, the title, or the Duke's affections beyond the stated term. Eleanor had read the document twice in the solicitor's dim office, her father's debts spread across the opposite desk, like a map of everything she had lost. Sir Richard Graves had been a good physician and a kind father and a disastrous manager of money. He had died in January with £800 owed to creditors who had already begun selling his instruments. The settlement would clear the debts and leave Eleanor with enough to establish herself modestly in Bath or Cheltenham when the year was done. She had signed without looking at the Duke, who stood at the window with his back to the room and his hands clasped behind him, as though the transaction concerned someone else entirely. The wedding had been small and cold. 6 witnesses, no music, no flowers. Lady Marguerite had worn black. Eleanor had worn her mother's gray silk for the first time, and the Duke had placed the ring on her finger with the precise, impersonal care of a man settling an invoice. They had traveled to Lenox Park in separate carriages. Eleanor had been shown to her rooms by Mrs. Bellamy, the old housekeeper, who had looked at her with an expression that lived somewhere between pity and something warmer. Something that might, in time, become loyalty. The first weeks had passed in a kind of bewildered industry. Eleanor had learned the house, room by enormous room, until she could walk the corridors in the dark and know by the change in the air when she had passed from the east wing into the west. She had learned the names of every servant, every tenant, every horse in the stable. She had memorized which floorboards creaked outside the Duke's study and which door hinges needed oiling before spring. She had learned the particular quality of light that entered the morning room at 7, pale and hesitant, as though it too were uncertain of its welcome. She had learned, above all, the rhythm of the Duke's days, which were early and solitary and governed by a discipline so severe it resembled grief. He rose at 6. He rode at 7, returning with mud on his boots and a set to his jaw that suggested the ride had been less recreation than punishment. He closeted himself in the library from 9 until 2, and the servants knew not to knock unless the house was on fire, and perhaps not even then. He dined alone more often than not, and when he did not, the conversation was civil, correct, and confined to matters of the estate. He asked her once about the household accounts. He asked her twice about the tenants' rents. He did not ask her about her father, her childhood, her opinions, or her happiness, and she did not offer them, because the contract had not mentioned happiness. And Eleanor was a woman who read contracts carefully. She had learned, too, the rhythm of Lady Marguerite's campaign. The Dowager called twice a week. She brought Miss Cecily Pemberton with her on every 3rd visit, a diamond of the season before last, golden-haired, accomplished, connected to half the peerage through her mother's family. Miss Pemberton was everything a Duchess of Lennox ought to be. Lady Marguerite made certain Eleanor understood this without ever saying it directly. What Lady Marguerite did not see, because she arrived after 10 and left before 3, was what Eleanor did with her mornings. She rose at 6, as the Duke did, and walked the east wing before the household stirred. She checked the kitchen stores, reviewed the menus with Mrs. Bellamy, consulted with the head gardener about the south beds, and answered the tenants' letters that accumulated on the small desk in the morning room. She had discovered, within the first month, that the previous housekeeper had left the accounts in disorder, and that the tradesmen in the village had been overcharging the estate for lamp oil and candles by a margin that would have made her father, for all his financial recklessness, furious. She had corrected the accounts quietly and without informing the Duke. The other thing Lady Marguerite did not see was Henry. Henry Ashworth was 7 years old, the orphaned son of the Duke's younger brother, George, who had died at Salamanca. Henry had been placed in the nursery wing at Lenox Park 3 years ago, attended by a nurse and a tutor, and he had not, according to Mrs. Bellamy, spoken a voluntary sentence to any adult in the house for 5 months. Eleanor had found him on her 3rd morning, sitting beneath the library table with a wooden horse clutched in both hands and his face turned to the wall. The library smelled of old leather and beeswax and the particular staleness of a room that was used for work and never for comfort. Eleanor had not spoken to him. She had sat down on the floor beside the table, arranged her skirts on the cold wood, opened her father's small leather volume of Cowper, and read aloud, as though to herself, The boy's breathing had changed after the first page, slowing from the shallow, held rhythm of a child braced for interruption to something deeper and more trusting. After 20 minutes, the wooden horse had inched closer to her knee. After 40, Henry had placed his head against her arm and closed his eyes. She read to him every morning after that. She came before 7. When the nurse was still at breakfast and the tutor had not yet arrived. She brought the cowper, and occasionally a biscuit wrapped in cloth from the kitchen. She did not try to make him speak. She did not ask him questions or offer him cheerful observations about the weather. She simply sat on the library floor and read. And the boy, who had retreated so far into his silence that the physician had begun using words like melancholia, pulled his chair closer to hers each morning until there was no distance left between them. She did not mention it to anyone. On the morning of the 11th day, the Duke came to the library early. He stood in the doorway for a long time. Eleanor did not know he was there. She was seated on the floor with her back against the shelves, the cowper open on her lap, and Henry curled beside her with the wooden horse tucked under his chin. She was reading the passage about the winter evening, the one her father had annotated in his small cramped hand with the single word, home. The Duke's hand found the doorframe. His knuckles tightened against the wood. He watched the boy's face, which was peaceful in a way it had not been peaceful in 3 years, and he watched Eleanor's hand, which rested lightly on the boy's hair, as though it had always belonged there. He left before she saw him. His stride down the corridor was faster than usual, and when he passed Mrs. Bellamy on the landing, the old housekeeper saw something in his face she had not seen since the year of his first wife's death. She could not have named it. She would not have tried. That afternoon, the Duke came to the morning room where Eleanor was reviewing the week's menus. He stood in the doorway, which seemed to be his habit, as though entering fully would constitute an admission. "You have been reading to Henry," he said. Eleanor set down her pen. "I have, Your Grace." "He does not speak to the nurse." "He does not need to speak. He needs someone to sit with him." The Duke's jaw tightened. For a moment, Eleanor thought she had overstepped. Then he said, "Continue," and turned and left the room. His voice had been low and level, and the single word had carried the weight of something far heavier than permission. Eleanor's hand, which had been steady on the pen, trembled for a full 3 seconds after the door closed. 2 days later, he issued his second command. Eleanor had been walking the east garden in a morning drizzle that had thickened into proper rain, cataloging the damage to the rose beds from the previous week's frost. Her gown was soaked at the hem. Her hair had loosened from its pins and lay flat against her neck. "Come inside," the Duke said from the terrace door. "Not a request. Not an invitation. An order, issued in the same level tone with which he managed every transaction of his life, as though sheltering a woman from the rain were no different from instructing the groom to bring the carriage round." Eleanor came inside. She stood in the hall, dripping onto the stone floor, and for a moment she felt his gaze on the wet fabric at her collarbone, on her loosened hair, on the mud at the edge of her shoe. The rain had turned her gray silk dark, and the fabric clung to her arms in a way that made her aware of her own body in a way she had trained herself not to be. He handed her a folded cloth without comment. His fingers did not touch hers. The space between their hands, roughly the width of a playing card, carried more weight than any touch she had received in 10 months. "The rose beds will need replanting," she said, because saying anything practical was safer than standing in the silence he was building around her. "I will speak to the gardener. I have already written a list. The damask varieties are salvageable. The alba is not." He looked at her. It was the look from the ballroom, the one she had dismissed as nothing, except that it lasted longer and she was closer, and the hall was empty, and there was no crowd to absorb the heat of it. Then he turned and walked away, his boots loud on the flagstones, and Eleanor pressed the cloth to her face and breathed in the scent of clean linen. And beneath it, very faintly, something that might have been sandalwood, and might have been him. That night, Eleanor lay in her bed in the east wing and pressed her hand against her breastbone, where something small and inconvenient had taken root. She told herself it was the cold. She told herself the contract was clear and the terms were specific, and that in 2 months she would board a coach to Bath and begin the work of forgetting. She told herself all of these things, and her hand stayed at her breastbone, and the rain fell against the window, and she did not sleep. Lady Marguerite arrived on Thursday with Miss Pemberton and a guest list for the Christmas ball. She sat in the drawing room with her gloves still on, a posture that communicated the temporary nature of Eleanor's occupancy more effectively than any speech. "My dear," she said to Miss Pemberton, smoothing the list on her knee, "we must discuss the seating. After the new year, when the year bride has gone, these arrangements will fall to you." Miss Pemberton had the grace to lower her eyes. Eleanor, entering the room with the tea tray because the footman was occupied in the cellar, heard the phrase land like a stone dropped into still water. The year bride. She set the tray down with hands that did not shake, and poured 3 cups with the composure of a woman who had been trained by poverty to absorb insult as fact. "Cream, Lady Marguerite?" she asked. The dowager looked at her as though she had spoken from a great distance. "No," she said. "I take my tea plain." Eleanor poured. The dowager's cup was porcelain with a blue rim, part of a set that had been in the Ashworth family for 3 generations. Eleanor's hands were red from the garden and from the cold and from the morning's work in the still room, where she had been bottling preserves for the tenants' Christmas baskets. She set the cup down without rattling the saucer, and Miss Pemberton watched her fingers with an expression that was not contempt, exactly, and was not admiration, and was something more complicated than either. The dinner that followed the dowager's visit was the first at which the Duke and Eleanor were joined by outside company. Lord and Lady Farrow had come from Wiltshire. Sir Edmund Chesney, a neighbor and an old friend of the Duke's father, had brought his wife and his eldest daughter. The table was laid for 10, and Eleanor sat at its foot in her gray silk, while Miss Pemberton, seated at the dowager's right hand, wore new ivory satin with pearls. The conversation moved through weather and hunting, and the prospects for the winter session of Parliament. Eleanor managed the table as she had managed the household, with a competence so quiet it became invisible. She signaled the footman for the second course at precisely the right moment. She noticed Sir Edmund's empty glass before the butler did, and corrected it with a glance that moved across the table like a hand across a page. She redirected Sir Edmund's rambling anecdote about a horse race with a question so deftly placed that Lady Farrow later told her husband she had not even noticed the rescue. Miss Pemberton watched Eleanor from the dowager's right hand with an expression Eleanor could not read. It was not the open disdain Lady Marguerite wore like a brooch. It was something quieter, something that might have been the first hairline fracture of certainty in a young woman who had been told her whole life that the position she occupied was hers by right, and was now watching someone else fill it with a competence that had nothing to do with birthright. The roast arrived. The conversation turned to the improvements at Hatherley Hall and the new rector's unfortunate sermon on charitable obligation. And then, between the roast and the pudding, Lady Farrow leaned toward Lady Marguerite and said in the carrying undertone of a woman who believes herself unheard, "How long does the year bride have left? 2 months?" The table's silence was very brief. Lady Marguerite smiled. Miss Pemberton touched her pearls. The Duke set down his fork with a precision that caused the silverware to ring once against the china, a small, clear sound in the stillness. "Lady Farrow," he said. His voice was level. Nothing more, just her name, spoken with a precision that caused her to sit very straight and reach for her wine with a hand that was no longer steady. Eleanor looked at her plate. The roast sat cooling in its juice. She picked up her knife and cut a piece she did not eat, and her pulse, which had been steady all evening, climbed into her throat and stayed there. She was aware, with the heightened perception of a woman whose body had learned to catalog danger in the pitch of other people's voices, that every person at the table had heard the phrase, and that every person at the table understood it as a statement of fact. After dinner, the Duke found her in the corridor outside the dining room. She was standing with one hand on the wall, breathing carefully, the way she had learned to breathe when her father's creditors came to the house and she had to receive them in the parlor, with tea she could not afford, and a composure she could not quite sustain. "Sit down," he said. "I am perfectly well, Your Grace." "Sit down, Eleanor." Her name. He had never used it before, not once in 10 months of marriage. She had been Your Grace and Madam, and when he forgot himself, nothing at all. A pronoun at best, a silence at worst. Eleanor. 3 syllables spoken in a low voice in a cold corridor, and she sat down on the hall bench because her knees would no longer hold her. He stood over her for a moment, his face unreadable in the candlelight. The corridor was narrow and poorly lit, and the sounds of the dining room, where Lady Marguerite was holding court over the pudding, reached them as a distant murmur. Then he reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a small oval miniature in a tarnished silver frame. He looked at it for a long time, the way a man looks at a wound he has learned to carry. "Catherine," he said. "My first wife. She died 4 years ago in childbed. The child did not survive." He paused. The miniature caught the candlelight, and the young woman's painted face seemed to shift in the flickering. Dark hair. A shy, direct gaze. The kind of face that would have looked up from a book with an expression of startled welcome. "I was in London when it happened. I had been called to Parliament for a vote that did not, in the end, change anything of consequence. I did not return in time. The physician said it would not have mattered, that I could not have changed the outcome. I have not found that observation useful." The corridor was very quiet. Eleanor could hear her own breathing and his, and the distant clink of crystal from the dining room, and the faint tick of the long case clock at the end of the hall. "She would not have wanted you to carry that," Eleanor said. "No," the Duke said. "She would not." He replaced the miniature in his pocket, and his hand lingered at his breast as though pressing the small frame closer to the place it had worn, smooth through the lining of 4 years' worth of coats. He looked at Eleanor with an expression she had not seen before, something cracked and careful, as though the mask had slipped and he was deciding whether to retrieve it. "You read to Henry?" "Yes." "He laughed yesterday. Mrs. Bellamy told me. He has not laughed in this house since George died." Eleanor said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not have cost more than she could afford, and she had learned, in a year of contracts and settlements, and carefully managed expectations, the precise value of silence. The Duke looked at the wall above her head. 2 months, he said. The words were flat and uninflected, as though he were reading them from the contract itself. Then he turned and walked down the corridor, and his boots sounded on the flagstones with a rhythm that was slower than usual, as though each step were being placed with deliberation. And Eleanor sat on the bench with her hands folded in her lap, and felt the small, inconvenient thing beneath her breastbone grow into something she could no longer mistake for cold. If what she carried had a name, she was not yet prepared to speak it. Some truths require more courage than others. This was the kind that required everything. She did not know, sitting there, that what waited was worse. The week before Christmas, Lady Marguerite called a gathering. She did not call it a party. She called it a consultation, by which she meant a public stage on which the transition of power from the year bride to the proper bride could begin. She invited the Farrows, the Chesneys, Miss Pemberton and her mother, the rector and his wife, and Mr. Harding, the solicitor, whose presence she framed as a matter of administrative convenience. The drawing room at Lenox Park was arranged with the precision of a military operation. Lady Marguerite sat in the high-backed chair beside the fire with the contract on her lap, its red ribbon untied, its pages open. Miss Pemberton sat beside her in a gown of winter white. Eleanor sat in the straight-backed chair near the window, where the light was poor, her hands folded, her father's cowper in her pocket, because she had been reading to Henry when the summons came and had not had time to return the book to the shelf. "I have asked Mr. Harding to attend," Lady Marguerite said, "because the terms of the arrangement are approaching their natural conclusion, and I believe it is appropriate to review them in the presence of those who will be most affected." Mr. Harding shifted in his seat. He was a careful man, and careful men do not enjoy being placed at the center of public theater. He opened his mouth to object. Lady Marguerite read the terms aloud. She read them in a clear, unhurried voice, each clause delivered with the calm authority of a woman reading a tenancy agreement for a property she intended to reclaim. The settlement of £3,000 per annum for the duration of the marriage, the lump sum of £1,000 upon dissolution, the prohibition against any claim upon the estate, the title, or the Duke's affections beyond the stated term. She read the clause about personal effects, which specified that the Duchess would remove only those items she had brought with her. She read it all, pausing between clauses the way a judge pauses between sentences, and the room listened, and Lady Farrow nodded at each provision as though confirming arithmetic she had already done, and Eleanor sat in her chair by the poor window and felt the words move through her body like weather. When it was finished, Lady Marguerite folded the document and placed it on the table beside her tea. "The terms are clear," she said. "The year ends on the 14th of January. I trust arrangements for the departure can be made before Christmas, so the household may begin the new year, as it means to continue." Eleanor stood. The room looked at her. She was aware of the gray silk, which was the only good gown she owned, and of her hands, which were roughened from the garden and the still-room, and of the cowper pressing against her hip through the fabric of her pocket. "I have honored every term of that contract, Lady Marguerite," she said. Her voice was quiet and level. "I have managed this household, attended every function, answered every tenant's letter, and kept the accounts in better order than they have been kept in a decade. I will leave on the 14th, as the contract specifies. I will not leave before." She walked out of the room with her spine straight and her chin level, and her hands, which no one could see, shaking at her sides. In the corridor last week, the housekeeper murmured to the cook that evening, "I heard Sir Edmund's daughter call her the year bride, and her grace smiled as though someone had handed her a gift." The third voicing. Eleanor heard it through the still-room door, where she had gone to finish the Christmas baskets, because finishing the baskets was the kind of task a woman could do when the alternative was to stop moving entirely. She packed the last jar of preserves. She wiped her hands on her apron. She went upstairs and began to fold her dresses into the trunk she had brought from her father's house, the one with the scratched brass lock and the faint smell of lavender. Henry found her there. He stood in the doorway of her room with the wooden horse in his hand, and said, in the clearest voice he had used in 5 months, "Are you going away?" Eleanor knelt on the floor beside the trunk and looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I believe I am." "Will you come back?" She could not answer that. She pulled him close and pressed her face against his hair, and the Cowper fell from her pocket onto the floor. Its pages opened to the passage about the winter evening. The word home, visible in her father's careful hand. She did not cry. She had not cried since January, when they lowered Sir Richard Graves into the ground, and she had stood alone at the graveside in a borrowed black dress, and understood that grief, like debt, was something you carried until you could not. The Lennox Christmas Ball was held on the 23rd of December, in the same ballroom where Eleanor had stood at the edge 10 months ago in her mother's gray silk. The same candles burned. The same families filled the floor. The same column stood where Eleanor had pressed her back against it and held her warm lemonade with both hands. She wore the gray silk again, because it was the only gown she had, and because she was leaving in the morning, and because wearing it felt like a kind of honesty the room could read whether it wished to or not. Lady Marguerite stood at the center of the ballroom in sapphires and midnight blue, Miss Pemberton beside her in silver. The dowager's posture radiated the particular satisfaction of a woman who has waited a long time for a clock to run out. Mr. Harding stood near the door with his leather case, ready to produce the dissolution papers at the dowager's signal. Eleanor stood by the far column. She had already said goodbye to Mrs. Bellamy, whose eyes had been red and whose handshake had been fiercer than protocol permitted. She had already placed the Cowper on the nursery shelf where Henry could reach it. She had already removed the ring, which sat in its velvet box on the dressing table of the room that would be Miss Pemberton's by the new year. She was ready. Her trunk was packed. The carriage to Bath had been arranged for 7 in the morning. And then the Duke entered the ballroom. He came from the library, where he had been closeted with Mr. Harding for the better part of an hour, and his face was not wearing the formal mask. His face was wearing something Eleanor had seen only once before, in the corridor outside the dining room, when he had spoken his dead wife's name and the silver frame had caught the light. Something cracked open. Something decided. He crossed the ballroom floor. The room watched. It took him 6 strides to reach her, and by the 4th stride, Lady Marguerite's smile had begun to falter. And by the 5th, Miss Pemberton had set down her glass. And by the 6th, Eleanor's hand had found the column behind her. Because the look on his face was not the look of a man concluding a transaction. He stopped in front of her. The ballroom was very quiet. "Your Grace," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. Her hand against the column was not. He reached into his breast pocket. Eleanor expected the miniature, the tarnished silver frame, Catherine's shy, direct gaze. He did not withdraw the miniature. He withdrew the ring. Her ring? The one she had left on the dressing table in its velvet box. "You left this," he said. "The contract ends in January, Your Grace. The ring is yours. The contract ended an hour ago." His voice carried across the silent room. "I asked Mr. Harding to void it." Lady Marguerite rose from her chair. "James." He did not turn. He kept his eyes on Eleanor. "The year is over," he said. "The marriage is not." The room drew a single collective breath. Lady Farrow's fan stopped mid-motion. Sir Edmund set down his glass. The rector's wife pressed her hand to her throat. And Lady Marguerite, who had never in her life been publicly contradicted by her son, stood beside the fire with her lips parted and no sound coming from them. "You cannot," she said at last. The arrangement was clear. The girl has no family, no fortune, no position. She is a physician's daughter with debts. She is the woman who restored my household, the Duke said, still not turning. She corrected the accounts. She answered the tenants. She sat on the floor of my library every morning for 9 months and read to a boy who had forgotten how to speak. And she did not tell me because she did not believe it was remarkable. She did not ask for recognition because she does not know how to ask for anything for herself. He paused. His voice, which had been level and low, did not rise. She is my wife. I am not letting her leave. Mr. Harding stepped forward with a document in his hand. The original contract has been voided by mutual consent of the parties, Your Grace, he said, addressing Lady Marguerite. A new settlement has been drawn. The Duchess of Lennox retains her title, her position, and full rights to the estate in perpetuity. Lady Marguerite looked at her son's back. She looked at Eleanor's face. She looked at Miss Pemberton, who was standing very still with her hands clasped, and an expression that was not disappointment exactly, and was not relief, and was the quiet recognition of a woman who had understood, perhaps before anyone else in the room, that she had been standing in someone else's place. The dowager sat down. It was the first time Eleanor had ever seen her sit without choosing the highest chair in the room. She sat in the nearest chair, which was small and wooden, and placed against the wall for the musicians. And her posture, for the first time in Eleanor's memory, was not perfectly erect. Eleanor looked at the ring in the Duke's hand. I cannot accept this, she said, if it is given from obligation. It is not. He took her hand. His fingers were warm and steady, and Eleanor felt the tremor move from her hand into his, or from his into hers, and the origin did not matter. Eleanor, he said. Just her name. The second time he had spoken it, and the room heard it. And Mrs. Bellamy, standing in the doorway with a tray she had forgotten to set down, pressed her free hand to her mouth. He placed the ring on her finger. It fit the way it had fit 10 months ago in the solicitor's office, which was to say perfectly, which was to say as though the hand had been measured for it by someone who had been paying closer attention than anyone knew. 20 years later, the ring was still there. It was scratched now. And the gold had thinned at the band where it pressed against the handle of the garden trowel she used every morning in the south beds. The gray silk had long since been retired to a trunk in the attic, replaced by gowns that fit her properly, ordered from London and chosen with care, though Eleanor still preferred colors that did not demand attention. Henry was 27. He had his uncle's height and his father's discipline and his aunt's habit of reading Cowper aloud to anyone who would listen. He had brought a girl to dinner last month, a clergyman's daughter with ink-stained fingers and a laugh that filled the dining room, and Eleanor had watched the Duke's face across the table and seen something she recognized. A softness around the jaw, a stillness in the eyes, the particular expression of a man watching a pattern he had believed broken. Begin again. The drawing room at Lennox Park was warm. Snow fell against the windows in the slow, unhurried way that December snow falls when it has nowhere else to be. A fire burned in the grate. The miniature of Catherine sat on the mantel now, not in his pocket, and beside it stood a small framed sketch of Sir Richard Graves that Eleanor had found in her father's papers, and had quietly placed there in her second year, and that the Duke had never moved. Eleanor sat in the chair by the fire with the Cowper open on her lap. The leather was cracked now, the spine soft with use. Her father's annotation, the single word home, in his careful, cramped hand, was faded to the color of weak tea. The Duke sat across from her. He was reading a letter from the steward about the spring planting, and his reading glasses sat low on his nose, and his hair, which had been dark when she married him, was gray at the temples in a way that made him look less like carved stone and more like the man he had always been underneath. He looked up. "You are staring," he said. "I am," Eleanor said. "Is there something you require?" "No," she said. "There is nothing I require." He held her gaze for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved, very slightly, in the expression that 20 years ago would have been unreadable and that she now understood was the closest he came to a smile of pure contentment. He returned to his letter. She returned to her cowper. The snow continued to fall. The fire settled. The clock on the mantel, which had been keeping time in this room for 4 generations of Ashworths, measured the silence between them with the patient, unhurried rhythm of a house that had learned at last what it was for. "Thank you for staying until the end. If Eleanor's quiet kept you company tonight, leave a word before you go."